Hey there, welcome back. Tonight, we were taking a quiet journey into something both wild and ancient, the world of the Vikings. Long before the word Viking meant horned helmets or raging seas, it meant something simpler, a person on an expedition. Men and women from the cold edges of the north, setting out across oceans and centuries. By watching this video, you'll learn how the Vikings lived, where they came from, what they believed, how they built their homes and ships, how they survived endless winters, and who their descendants are today. You'll drift through frozen fjords, longhouses lit by firelight, and stories carved into stone, not to glorify war, but to remember how ordinary people built extraordinary lives in a harsh and beautiful world. So let's slow down, breathe a little, and take a closer look at what life was really like in the far north. All you have to do is settle in, get comfortable, and let the story drift over you, like the soft rustle of a wool cloak beside a fire. And before we begin, a quiet note. If you enjoy these slow, sleepy journeys through history, consider liking the video or subscribing, only if you really enjoy it. And while you're here, tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. I love imagining this invisible web of listeners scattered across the world, drifting off to the same tale under different skies. It begins around the year 750 AD, in a land where daylight could last only a few hours, and winters seemed eternal. The people who would become known as the Vikings lived in Scandinavia, what we now call Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Their world was carved by ice and sea, deep fjords, dense pine forests, and islands battered by wind. To the west lay the North Atlantic, to the east the cold rivers of what would one day become Russia. The land was poor in crops, but rich in courage and in curiosity. Life was simple, hard, and deeply communal. Every village was a small circle of longhouses, bound together by kinship and survival. A single storm could destroy a harvest. A harsh winter could erase an entire family line. So people learned to read the sky, the soil, and the sea as though they were living things. The air smelled of pine smoke and salt, and every sound, the creak of timber, the cry of gulls, the whisper of snow, reminded them of both danger and belonging. The Vikings were not one tribe nor one kingdom. They were farmers, fishermen, traders, and craftsmen who shared language, beliefs, and courage. They spoke Old Norse, a language whose echoes still live on today in Icelandic and in words scattered across English, sky, window, knife, husband. Their gods were many: Odin, Thor, Freya, Loki, divine figures who embodied both wisdom and wildness. To live in the north was to feel close to such gods, not distant and unreachable, but walking beside you in storms and dreams. Their descendants today are the Scandinavians, the Norwegians, Swedes, Danes, and Icelanders who carry traces of that old spirit in language, in folklore, and in quiet endurance. Genetic studies even find Viking roots as far away as Scotland, Ireland, England, France, and parts of Eastern Europe, carried by those who sailed, settled, and stayed. But before they became warriors of legend, they were simply people trying to survive. Imagine standing at the edge of a fjord on a gray morning. The mist rises off the water, cold against your face. Wood smoke drifts from the roof of your longhouse. Your hands are rough from hauling nets or chopping firewood. The day begins in silence, except for the low sound of waves tapping against the shore. Somewhere, someone is mending a fishing net. Someone else is baking flatbread over a stone hearth. The world is small, but it is alive. The Viking world revolved around cycles, the seasons, the tides, and the constant turning between darkness and light. In summer, they farmed and traded. In winter, they gathered by the fire and told stories of gods and ancestors. Their time was measured not by clocks, but by migrations of birds, the waxing of the moon, the freeze and thaw of rivers. Each year, They prepared for the same rhythm, endurance followed by brief abundance. If you could walk into a Viking longhouse, the first thing you'd feel would be warmth and smoke. The walls were made of timber, lined with wool, moss, or straw to keep the cold away. The hearth sat in the middle, the heart of every home. There, meals were cooked, children played, and stories were told until the embers dimmed. At night, the fire crackled softly while the northern wind pressed against the roof. You might hear someone whispering a prayer to Thor for safety or to Freya for love. Even sleep felt sacred, a fragile truce between frost and flame. To an outsider, it might seem that such a life was filled only with hardship. But to the people of the North, it was purpose. To wake each morning, to feed one's family, to carve a boat from driftwood. These were acts of quiet devotion. They saw beauty in endurance, dignity in labor, and faith in repetition. Every scar on their hands was a reminder that they had met the world and survived it. And slowly, from this stillness, something began to stir. Young men stood at the edge of the water, watching gulls disappear into the mist. They listened to stories of distant lands, of gold, of grain, of glory. Their boats, once used for fishing, began to grow longer and sleeker. Curiosity turned into movement, and movement into history. The Viking story, after all, begins not with conquest, but with a longing to see what lies beyond the horizon, and to test whether the same hands that built fires in the dark could also build worlds across the sea. Tonight, that's where our journey begins. Here, beneath the northern lights, where snow glows faintly on the hills, and the pass feels close enough to breathe. In the next quiet stretch of time, the sea will begin to whisper to them, and when it does, the world will never be the same. The story drifts onward, still under the pale shimmer of northern skies. The sea has not yet called them far. Not yet, for now life remains anchored to the land, to the quiet labor that shaped every heartbeat of the early Norse world. Before the Vikings were sailors or conquerors, they were people bound to soil, to season, and to faith, a faith not in comfort, but in endurance. The land itself was a teacher, both cruel and kind. In Norway, mountains rose like frozen waves, their peaks crowned with snow even in summer. In Sweden, deep forests stretched for days, threaded by rivers that gleamed like glass. And in Denmark, the earth rolled low and fertile, dotted with small farms and wind-bent trees. Each region carried its own rhythm, its own tone of survival. Together, they formed a landscape that shaped the people as much as the people shaped it. Winters were long and silent. The sun might not rise for weeks at a time, leaving villages wrapped in a blue half-light where breath turned to frost. Families huddled close inside longhouses, their days marked by small rituals, feeding the animals, tending the fire, mending clothes by the flicker of tallow lamps. Outside, snow muffled every sound. You could almost hear time itself slowing down. Then, when the world thawed, spring brought movement, a rush of meltwater, the smell of damp earth, the first calls of birds returning home. Men repaired boats and tools, women planted barley and flax, children chased each other through the mud, while elders sat by the doorways, watching the fog roll off the fjords. The year was reborn again, fragile and uncertain, but alive. Every task carried meaning. To till the soil was to speak to the gods. To forge iron was to shape fate. The Norse believed that all things, wind, tree, flame, even stone, held spirit and intention. This belief was called animism, though they never named it as such. To them, the world was alive with unseen voices. A waterfall could listen, a mountain could remember, and if one paid attention, the land itself could answer. They built their lives within this delicate web of respect and fear. Each family honored its desire. protective female spirits said to watch over the household, and offered small bowls of ale or milk to keep them pleased. Before hunting or fishing, they whispered to the spirits of the forest and the sea. Death was not an end, merely a passage to another realm, one of many woven together beneath Yggdrasil, the great world tree that linked gods, men, and monsters alike. At the top of that cosmic tree dwelled Asgard, home of the gods. At its roots lay Helheim, the shadowed land of the dead. And somewhere between the two was Midgard, the world of humans. When thunder rolled across the mountains, they said it was Thor driving his chariot through the clouds, defending Midgard from the giants beyond. When the aurora shimmered across the sky, it was seen as the gleam of the Valkyries' armor as they guided the fallen to Valhalla. Faith was not confined to temples. It lived in gesture and habit, in the way one salted bread before eating, or carved protective runes into a doorframe. The Vikings prayed with their hands as much as with their words. A sword, a seed, a song, all were offerings in their own way. But life was not all mysticism. Theirs was a pragmatic faith, born of necessity. When snow trapped them indoors for months, survival depended on preparation. They dried fish and smoked meat over the fire, stored grain in wooden bins, wove wool into thick cloaks, and patched every roof before the storms came. Tools were shared, not hoarded. Neighbors were family when the cold came creeping through the cracks. Women played a vital role in this rhythm of endurance. They ran the farms when men were away, managed food stores, raised children, and often led spiritual life as vulvas, seeresses believed to speak with fate itself. Clad in blue cloaks and silver jewelry, a vulva could enter trance and interpret dreams, guiding communities through sickness, hunger, and war. To a people without written scripture, her words were law and comfort. Children learned early. Boys practiced archery, herded animals, and followed their fathers to the forge or field. Girls learned weaving, herbs, and storytelling. No one was idle. Even play was practice for adulthood. And yet, in this world of labor, there was laughter. At night, families gathered around the hearth. Stories were told of gods and heroes, of trickster Loki's mischief, and Odin's endless search for wisdom. Laughter mingled with the crackle of wood. Warmth replaced the weight of cold. There was also music, simple flutes made from bone, string instruments carved from pine, drums stretched with hide. Their melodies were repetitive, almost hypnotic, the kind that could make work feel like prayer. If you listened closely, you could hear rhythm in everything: the swing of an axe, the beat of a hammer, the crash of waves. Even the sea seemed to keep time with human hands. And always there was the ocean, never far from thought. It was both boundary and invitation. When storms howled outside, families sat inside and spoke of the world beyond, of distant lands seen by merchants, of islands rumored to lie across the horizon. The sea frightened them, but it also whispered to them. Every generation, someone listened more closely than the rest. The Norse sense of belonging came not from wealth, but from place. A person was known by where they came from. The valley, the fjord, the family. Names themselves carried the weight of ancestry. Eriksson, son of Erik, Olafsdottir, daughter of Olaf. To lose one's land was to lose identity. That's why they fought the earth for every field, every stone, every handful of grain that could sustain them through the next frost. The more they worked, the more they dreamed. Dreams of warmer lands, easier harvests, wider trade. They heard tales of soft green shores to the west, of silver coins minted in the south, of rivers leading to unknown empires in the east. And though their feet were still bound to frozen ground, their minds had already begun to wander. For now, though, the north held them close, in its silence, its cruelty, its beauty. It was a place that could break you or bless you, depending on how you met it. And perhaps that is why the Vikings endured. They learn not to conquer the cold, but to move with it, to bend, not to break. Soon, the ocean will rise again in their dreams. Soon, they will test the boundaries of that faith and discover that the gods, too, live beyond the horizon. Night falls early in the north. The last traces of daylight fade from the fjord, leaving only the faint silver of snow and the glow of smoke rising from the roofs. Inside the longhouses, the world grows small again, a world of warmth, sound, and flickering light. Here, beneath low timber beams blackened by decades of fire, the Vikings lived most of their lives. The sea and the sword made legends, but the hearth made a people. Step inside one of these longhouses. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, stew, and wool. A single fire burns in the center, feeding both heat and life. The smoke climbs slowly toward the hole in the roof, drifting sideways before slipping out into the cold. Around it, families eat, talk, mend, sing, and simply exist. The hum of daily life fills the space like a heartbeat, steady, human, unremarkable, and eternal. The walls are made from timber planks, sometimes covered with turf or clay. Carved beams show traces of stories, spirals, serpents, runes of protection. Animal skins hang from the rafters, drying for clothing or trade. Every surface has purpose, nothing is wasted. Benches double as beds, chests as tables. The flicker of the fire paints faces in amber and shadow, softening the hard lines of survival. In one corner, a woman weaves at a loom, her fingers moving without thought. The rhythmic click-click of wooden pegs keeps time with the low murmur of voices. Beside her, a small child stirs a pot with a carved spoon, eyes bright in the firelight. An old man sharpens a knife, slow and methodical. Every sound belongs. The scraping of metal, the soft thud of feet on earth, the hiss of sap in the burning logs. It is not quiet, but it is peace. The hearth is not just a place to cook. It is the center of faith and memory. Before every meal, a small piece of food is dropped into the flames, an offering to the spirits, to ancestors who still listen through smoke. Stories are shared here, of creation, of the gods, of the first humans formed from ash and elm. The younger ones listen with wide eyes as the elders speak of Ymir, the giant whose body became the world, and of Odin, who hung himself upon the tree to gain the wisdom of runes. The tales blend myth and memory until they feel indistinguishable. When the wind howls outside, the longhouse hums louder. Someone begins a song, a low, steady melody, half prayer, half lullaby. The words are old and simple, praises for good harvests, safe voyages, and love that survives the dark. Others join in quietly, their voices rising and falling like waves. The sound fills the rafters, mingling with the fire's crackle. It is how they kept the cold at bay, not only with warmth, but with rhythm. Evenings bring laughter too, games carved from bone and wood. Hanafatafel, a strategy game older than chess. Children toss small stones and guess runes for fun. Sometimes a wandering skald, a poet and storyteller, visits the settlement. He carries a small harp and stories of distant places, kings, battles, lost loves. He recites them by the fire, his voice rich and slow, shaping memory into song. In return, he is fed and sheltered. When he leaves, he carries new tales to the next village, ensuring that no story ever truly dies. The Viking household was not only a family, but a miniature world. Every member had a role. Men worked the fields, fished, built boats, and fought when duty called. Women oversaw the home, owned keys, and managed property, symbols of power and respect. In Norse law, a woman could divorce, inherit, or lead a farm. Strength was measured not only in battle, but in endurance and wisdom. Many sagas spoke of women whose advice saved clans from ruin, or whose courage matched any warrior's elders carried the weight of memory. They remembered old winters, forgotten roots, and ancestral feuds. Their words shaped decisions, their silences carried judgment. To grow old in such a world was both privilege and responsibility, a living link between what was and what would be. Children were raised with care but little sentimentality. They learned quickly that life was fragile. A broken bone, a failed harvest, a sudden storm, any could steal away tomorrow. Yet childhood still held wonder. They played with carved wooden animals, collected shells, and asked endless questions about gods and heroes. Each bedtime story was also a lesson in courage, loyalty, and patience. The longhouse also held echoes of faith. At one end stood small wooden figures, gods carved roughly by hand. A tiny Thor with his hammer, a serene Freya with her necklace, a one-eyed Odin carved from oak. Beside them lay offerings of bread, mead, or amber beads. To pray here was not to seek miracles, but balance. If the storm takes, let the next day give. If a child falls ill, may another thrive. The gods were partners in endurance, not distant masters. When guests arrived, they were welcomed with ritual courtesy. A bowl of water for washing hands, a horn of ale passed clockwise around the room. Hospitality was sacred. To turn someone away in winter was to invite bad fortune. So strangers became friends, and friends sometimes became kin. On clear nights, when the fire burned low, someone might open the door to look at the sky. The stars seemed endless, scattered like frost on black stone. Sometimes the aurora shimmered, green, pink, silver, and people whispered that the Valkyries were riding, guiding fallen warriors toward Valhalla. For a moment, the vastness of the world felt close, yet comforting, as though heaven itself had brushed against the roof of the home. Inside, the fire fades to embers. Children sleep beneath wool blankets. The smell of pine smoke lingers in the air. Someone adds another log to the fire, then wraps a fur cloak around their shoulders. Outside, wolves call across the valley, their cries echoing through the frozen dark. The family listens quietly, neither afraid nor surprised. They have heard those sounds all their lives. Here, in the hush of the longhouse, life is neither heroic nor tragic. It is ordinary, and therefore sacred. These moments, invisible to history, are what made the Viking world endure long after the raids ended and the kings turned to dust. It was not the swords that defined them, but the fire that never went out, and soon that same firelight will flicker on the faces of those who will change everything, men and women who begin to look toward the horizon and feel a restless pull in their hearts. The sea, once distant, is calling. Morning breaks slowly in the north. The pale light crawls across the fjord, touching the ice, the cliffs, and finally the dark hulls of boats pulled up along the shore. The smoke from the longhouses rises straight into the still air. Inside, people wake to another day, a day like countless before it, yet different in some unspoken way. Something is changing. The sea, once a border, has begun to feel like a path. For generations, the Norse had lived within the rhythm of land and sky. But even in the most rooted among them, there was always a whisper, a curiosity carried by wind and wave. They watched gulls vanish into the horizon, wondered where the whales traveled, and listened to the stories brought by drifting traders from the south. No one could say exactly when the first thought appeared. What if we followed the sea instead of fearing it? But once it came, it never left. Their ancestors had already known the water well. Fishing boats and small ferries dotted the fjords, built with curved wooden planks lashed together by iron nails and pine tar. Yet these were modest things, vessels of survival, not ambition. Then came the innovation that would change everything, the longship. Long, narrow, and light, it could cut through both river and sea with uncanny grace. Its shallow keel allowed it to glide close to shore or deep inland through winding waterways. The dragon-headed prow was more than decoration. It was a guardian, warding off spirits that lurked beyond the horizon. To build such a ship required patience, instinct, and reverence. Each tree was chosen carefully, felled at the right season so the wood would not split. The builders, shipwrights known for their craft, shaped every plank by hand, bending oak and pine into smooth, overlapping curves that could flex with the waves. They sealed the seams with wool, resin, and tar. When finished, the vessel looked alive, a creature born of both land and sea. The first voyage was never far, perhaps to a nearby island or down a new river. But once the keel touched open water, the horizon no longer felt distant. The men at the oars felt it too, a strange calm, a quiet rush beneath their hands. Each stroke carried not only the boat, but the beginning of something vast, a story that would one day stretch from Greenland to Constantinople. Life in those early boats was not for the faint-hearted. The sea could turn from gentle to deadly in a breath. One moment the sky was clear, the next black clouds rolled down from the north like a curtain. Rain lashed, winds screamed, and waves rose higher than houses. The Vikings did not conquer the ocean. They learned to listen to it. They studied the behavior of seabirds, the color of the water, the smell of the air before a storm. Their navigators watched the sun's path, the stars' rotation, and the flight of whales. Some even dropped bits of moss into the water to read the direction of the current. They had no maps, no compasses. Their tools were memory, instinct, and courage, and yet they reached places no one else dared to go. The sea became both classroom and church. Every sound carried meaning: the slap of the oars, the groan of the mast, the hiss of spray against wood. Men sang to keep rhythm, deep, wordless songs that rose and fell with the waves. Their hands blistered, their eyes stung from salt, but their hearts felt lighter than they ever had on land. It was said that on the open ocean a man could hear the voice of the gods more clearly than anywhere else. The first destinations were close, small islands for timber, furs, and fish. But soon they ventured farther: the coasts of Scotland, the Orkney and Shetland Islands, then Ireland. At first they came as traders, exchanging amber, wool, and iron for silver and wine. But when opportunity met desperation, trade turned into something darker. The 8th century was an age of hunger and uncertainty. Population grew faster than farmland. Clans fought over pastures. Winters grew colder. The sea, dangerous as it was, offered something the land could not: freedom. Freedom from feuds, from scarcity, from waiting for fate to strike. And so, small groups of men, farmers, fishermen, wanderers, gathered their courage, sharpened their blades, and set sail. They rowed into the mist, past the line where the sky and water became one. Behind them, the smoke of their villages faded. Ahead lay silence, opportunity, and fear. Each voyage was an act of faith. They prayed not to live forever, but to die well. Their gods, they believed, respected courage above all. To meet the sea without trembling was to honor Odin himself. When lightning struck the mast, some saw it not as doom, but as Thor's blessing, proof that he was watching. Even those who stayed behind felt the sea's pull. Wives and mothers watched the horizon for returning sails. Children grew up with stories of islands that shimmered with gold, or forests that never ended. Some men came back with treasures, foreign coins, silk, spices. Others never returned at all, and their names were whispered during winter feasts, spoken softly into cups of mead. The songs changed too. They began to include the rhythm of waves, the clatter of shields, the promise of discovery. New words entered the language: Vikinger, one who goes abroad to seek fortune. It did not mean raider yet. It meant traveler, explorer, seeker. To go a Viking was not to destroy, but to journey. Only later would the world remember the first meaning and forget the rest. The sea became a mirror of the soul, unpredictable, vast, and alive. To face it was to face one's own insignificance, and to find beauty in it. Perhaps that was the true beginning of the Viking Age. Not the first raid, but the first moment someone looked at the horizon and saw possibility instead of fear. The air changes now, colder, sharper, filled with a sense of momentum. Villages once content to trade fish and furs begin to talk of wealth beyond imagining. The longships grow larger, their dragon heads snarl against the wind. The gods seem to lean closer, listening. Soon, one of those ships will leave the fjords behind and strike the first spark that will set the north aflame. It will land not on a distant shore of mystery, but on a quiet island of monks, where prayers rise instead of smoke. And from that moment on, the world will know the Vikings not only as travelers, but as something far more powerful. It begins with the sound of oars in the dark. The sea is calm, the air cold enough to sting the skin. The men row without speaking, their breath forming mist that drifts away behind them. Only the creak of the wood and the steady rhythm of the oars break the silence. Ahead, faint through the fog, lies a small island, a place of prayer, of quiet, of peace. To the monks who sleep there, the night is no different from any other. But history has a way of arriving quietly, like the tide. The year is 793 AD, and the island is Lindisfarne, off the northeast coast of England. It is home to a small community of Christian monks, men who live by candlelight, copying scriptures, tending gardens, and ringing bells at dawn. Their world is measured by faith and by silence. The sound of approaching ships is rare here, and when it comes, it is usually a trader bringing wool, salt, or news from the mainland. But this sound is different. The steady beat of oars grows louder, closer, until the mist parts and the dark shapes of longships glide toward the shore. Their prows are carved with dragons and serpents. Their sails, when unfurled, are striped red and white. To the monks, it must have looked like something from Revelation, beasts rising from the sea. The bells ring out, but not for prayer. The Viking Age has begun. What happened that day has been told and retold, sometimes as terror, sometimes as triumph. But in truth, it was something simpler, an encounter between two worlds that did not yet understand each other. The Norsemen came seeking wealth, food, iron, and silver, the lifeblood of their harsh homelands. They found instead golden chalices, jeweled crosses, and undefended walls. The monks, who saw the world in terms of sin and salvation, saw in these men a storm of chaos. They wrote that the sky filled with lightning, that dragons were seen in the heavens. But the truth was this: the dragons were carved in oak and rode by human hands. To the Vikings, this raid was not blasphemy. It was opportunity and survival. They believed their gods rewarded bravery and cunning. If a man risked his life to bring back treasure, his name would live on in the sagas. If he died, he would feast in Valhalla. Either way, his life had meaning. Imagine the chaos in that small monastery. The crash of doors, the clang of iron against stone, the cries of men who had never held a weapon. And then, just as suddenly, silence again, the kind that follows thunder. Smoke rises where the thatch was burned. The raiders load their ships with what they can carry: silver, food, perhaps a few captives. Then they push off, the oars dipping into blood-stained water, and vanish into the mist as quickly as they came. By the time the survivors crawl from hiding, the sea is already empty. All that remains is the echo of their voices and the wreckage of what they believe to be untouchable. The word spreads across Christendom like fire through dry grass. The Northmen have come. News of the raid reached the courts of kings and bishops, who struggled to understand how men from such distant, frozen lands could strike so swiftly and disappear again. Priests called it divine punishment, a warning from God. But the truth was simpler still. The Vikings had mastered something others had not: mobility. Their longships could travel across open ocean and then up shallow rivers far beyond what any other vessel could manage. They could strike inland and vanish before an army could even assemble. Their power was not only in strength, but in movement, and so others followed. Word of easy wealth spread back to Scandinavia. The silver, the gold, the fear. More ships were built. More men took to the sea. Soon, raids reached the coasts of Ireland, Scotland, and Francia. Each journey carried more risk, but also more reward. And with each voyage, the North grew bolder. Yet, for all the blood and fire, these men were not monsters. They sang on their voyages, laughed, shared bread, and spoke of their families. Many were farmers who returned home after each raid to sow crops and repair their roofs. They were not kings or soldiers, just people searching for a better life in a world that gave them few options. The violence was real, but it was also the product of desperation and faith in destiny. To them, to live without courage was a greater sin than to kill in pursuit of survival. Some who went abroad never returned to raiding at all. They stayed. They traded with the locals, married, settled, learned new tongues. The very men who burned monasteries would later build towns beside them. The lines between raider and neighbor blurred, and in that blur something new began to form, a world connected by both sword and word. Back in Scandinavia, tales of these voyages were told around the hearth. The skalds sang of men who faced storms, enemies, and gods themselves, and lived. Children listened, eyes wide, as their fathers described lands where grass never froze and churches shimmered with gold. The idea of the Viking, the voyager, the seeker, took root in every young heart. The sea, once feared, had become a calling. But even as they celebrated their new power, others began to notice something else stirring. The raids brought not only wealth, but knowledge. From the monks came books, relics, and glimpses of a different world, a world ordered by faith and learning instead of fate and war. The North had looked outward and found not only silver, but mirrors, reflections of what they might one day become. When the next spring came, more ships left the fjords than ever before. Their sails glowed red in the dawn light. The old gods watched as their children took the sea once again, not merely as raiders, but as travelers, explorers, traders, and eventually settlers. The Viking Age was no longer a single moment. It was a tide, and it had begun to rise. For now, the fires of Lindisfarne still smolder. The waves whisper against the shore, erasing footprints, carrying the memory onward. To those who lived through it, it must have felt like the end of peace. To history, it was the beginning of something far greater, a story that would reach from frozen fjords to the edge of the known world. The tide had turned, and it would not turn back for centuries. From the fjords of Norway to the quiet coves of Denmark, the sea had become a highway, not just of travel, but of transformation. The first sparks of Lindisfarne had leapt across the North Sea, igniting a chain of raids that would change both the Vikings and the world they touched. Now, the coastlines of the British Isles, Ireland, and Francia stood like unguarded doorways, and the longships had learned how easily those doors could open. Picture a spring morning on the coast of Ireland. The fog still clings to the waves. The gulls circle above an abbey of stone and thatch. Inside, monks chant in soft Latin, their voices mingling with the sound of the surf. Then, faintly at first, comes the rhythmic thud of oars, steady, relentless. The first shouts echo from the shore, and soon the sea is filled with shadows that move like living creatures. The sails rise, red, white, black, and within minutes the air fills with the sound of axes striking wood, of doors splintering, of men calling out to gods both old and new. Smoke follows, always smoke. The raids spread like storm fronts, sudden, devastating, and gone before dawn. In Scotland, small monasteries along the islands of Iona and Skye fell silent. In Ireland, great centres of learning like Armagh and Clonmacnoise found themselves stripped of gold and manuscripts. To the monks, these men from the north were demons. To the raiders, they were just another obstacle between hunger and home. Yet even in violence, something deeper was happening, something quieter. The Vikings were learning. Every raid brought them into contact with new worlds, new ideas, new languages. They saw stone towers taller than any hall in Scandinavia, ships larger than their own, cities with markets that never slept. They began to imitate what they admired and adapt what they did not. In a strange way, every act of conquest was also an act of education. The longships themselves began to change. Builders experimented with broader hulls to carry more men, more cargo, more spoils. Sails grew larger. Iron tools became sharper. They mapped the coastlines by memory and star, finding rivers that reached deep inland. Soon, they realized something that few others had. Rivers were as powerful as seas. By following them, one could strike the very heart of kingdoms. So they did. They rode up the Seine, the Loire, and the Thames, bringing the fear of the north to the gates of Paris and London. They appeared from nowhere, burned what they wished, and vanished before an army could even form. To their victims, they were ghosts. To themselves, they were craftsmen of movement. But not every shore was taken by blood. The Vikings also traded, willingly, cleverly, endlessly. They brought furs, walrus ivory, amber, and iron in exchange for silver, wine, glass, and silk. Markets sprang up in unexpected places, the Hebrides, York, Rouen. Every new port carried echoes of two worlds colliding. Coins from Baghdad have been found buried in Swedish soil, silk from Byzantium wrapped around Norse bones. The raiders had become merchants without ever deciding to, driven by the same restlessness, but with a new purpose. In these markets, languages mingled. Latin, Old English, Frankish, and Norse blended into a strange new rhythm. Children grew up hearing more than one tongue. Love, too, ignored borders. Marriages between Northmen and local women became common, and with them came the first generation of mixed heritage children who belonged fully to neither world, yet carried both within them. The Viking story was already becoming everyone's story. Still, for those who stayed behind in the monasteries, the fear never faded. Chroniclers filled their pages with laments and omens. They wrote of lightning striking churches, of dragons in the sky, of stars bleeding red. They could not imagine these men as neighbors or traders, only as punishment made flesh. The Christian world and the pagan world were not yet ready to coexist, though they were already bound together by trade, by blood, and by time. To the Northmen, the difference between gods was less clear. If Christ granted victory, perhaps he was worth honoring. If the cross protected a village, maybe it had its own kind of magic. The Vikings were not ideologues. They were practical. If something worked, they used it. If it didn't, they moved on. Among themselves, however, their faith still burned bright. Before each voyage, offerings were made. A bull might be sacrificed to Thor for strength, or a handful of silver tossed into the waves for Aegir, god of the sea. When storms hit, men shouted prayers to whichever deity came to mind. Odin, Freya, Christ, whichever might be listening. Faith, like the sea, was not a fixed thing. It shifted, flowed, adapted. They did not see contradiction in believing many truths at once. The raids grew larger, better organized. By the 9th century, fleets of dozens, even hundreds, of ships struck entire kingdoms at once. What had begun as chance attacks became deliberate campaigns. And behind them, back home, small settlements grew rich. Gold and silver flowed north, building halls and temples that glimmered in the dim Scandinavian sun. For the first time, The north had wealth to rival the south, but wealth also brought division. Some wanted to keep raiding, others dreamed of settling, trading, ruling. The restless harmony of the Viking world began to hum with tension, between sword and plow, between tradition and change. On distant shores, smoke rises again, a monastery burns, and its bell melts into the earth. A few miles away, another group of Norsemen sits around a fire, roasting fish, counting coins, and speaking of home. The sea carries both, destruction and creation, and never chooses between them. It only moves. And in the dim light of a northern dawn, another fleet prepares to depart. Their ships gleam with fresh tar, their shields shine in the mist. They do not yet know that some of them will never return, and that those who do will bring back more than silver. They will bring back the first whispers of a wider world, and with them the faint beginnings of civilization's next chapter. For now, though, the sails rise again, and the horizon swallows them whole. The world burns at its edges, and in the north the forges burn brighter still. The smoke of conquest fades, and what remains is trade. After years of fire and silver, the Vikings had begun to realize something profound. There was more wealth in exchange than in destruction. What they once took by the sword, they could now earn by the oar. The same longships that carried warriors to distant shores could carry wool, furs, and amber instead. And in the calm between storms, a new kind of Viking began to emerge, one whose hands smelled more of salt and iron than of blood. Across Scandinavia, small harbors turned into bustling markets. The first to rise was Hedeby, near the border of modern Denmark and Germany, a natural crossroads between the North Sea and the Baltic. Its harbor was filled with ships of every shape and size, narrow traders from Norway, wide-bellied vessels from Frisia, and small river boats from the east. The air rang with sound, the calls of merchants, the bleating of animals, the clang of blacksmiths. In the mud streets, people from every corner of the known world met and mingled. To walk through Hedeby in the 9th century was to see the Viking world transformed. There were traders from the Frankish kingdom selling wine and fine cloth, Slavs from the east with wax and honey, Finns with furs so soft they shimmered in the light. There were even coins stamped with Arabic script, silver dirhams carried along the long trade routes from Baghdad through Russia and across the Baltic. The north, once thought to be the end of the world, had quietly become its artery. The Norse were quick to adapt. Where once they carried swords, they now carried scales. They learned to haggle, to count, to measure. They melted stolen silver into coins, marked with runes or crosses. An early sign that commerce could shape culture as deeply as faith. Even the word law, still used today, comes from the Old Norse lagu, meaning that which is laid down. Order was born from trade, not from conquest. Beyond Hedeby, other trading towns grew. Ribe, on the Jutland coast, bustled with glass workers, carpenters, and jewelers. Berka, on the Swedish lakes, shimmered with imported silk and bronze. Farther north, Kaupang became a gateway between Norway and the Arctic, where walrus ivory, reindeer hides, and whale bones fetched fortunes. The Norse were no longer just raiders. They were craftsmen, navigators, entrepreneurs. They understood that control of trade routes could bring more power than any raid. Markets had their own music. You could hear it in the shuffle of boots on planks, the laughter over cups of ale, the steady beat of a hammer shaping iron into tools or ornaments. A woman examined a strand of beads from the east, holding them up to the light. A trader poured honey into a clay jar, sealing it with wax. Children ran through the crowd, carrying messages or chasing geese. The air smelled of tar, sweat, and spice. It was loud, alive, human, and far from the quiet villages of the fjords. Trade also brought change to the home. Men who had once sailed for silver now brought back fabrics, spices, and strange objects, glass cups, bronze brooches, foreign coins. Women began to wear jewelry of new designs, mixing local motifs with southern styles. Stories of distant lands drifted back with every voyage, stories of deserts, of cathedrals, of cities where night never fell. The world, once imagined as small and enclosed, began to stretch outward in the Viking mind. Religion, too, began to shift with commerce. In markets where Thor's hammer pendants hung beside Christian crosses, faith became something negotiable, less a war of gods than a quiet coexistence. A trader might pray to Odin for luck before setting sail and thank Christ when he arrived safely. The old beliefs didn't die. They adapted, merging with the new. Every deal was, in its own way, a prayer for survival, but trade carried its own kind of danger. Wealth attracted envy. Kings began to demand tribute from merchants who passed through their lands. Clans quarreled over control of ports and tolls. Pirates, sometimes Norsemen themselves, prowled the same routes they once used for raiding. A merchant ship could vanish as easily as a warrior's, swallowed by storm or greed. And so the Vikings learned a new skill: diplomacy. They formed alliances, paid ransoms, and forged pacts. Silver changed hands more often than swords. The clever survived by balancing between powers: Frankish kings, Saxon lords, Slavic chiefs, Byzantine emperors. They spoke many tongues, swore many oaths, and broke just enough of them to stay free. In a world of borders, they became the ones who crossed them. In this age, the seafarer replaced the raider as the Norse ideal. To be a good sailor was to know the winds, the stars, and the moods of the sea. A single voyage from Hedeby to the Baltic, or from Birka to the Rus, lands could take weeks, filled with danger and discovery alike. Yet even when storms struck, or ice closed around the hull, the Norse saw beauty in it. They believed each journey was a test, not just of strength, but of patience and faith. A man who could endure the sea could endure anything. At night, the markets grew quiet again. The ships swayed gently at anchor. Fires burned low along the quays. Merchants sat beside their goods, counting coins, telling stories, and watching the stars. Somewhere across the dark water, they could hear the faint echo of a distant horn. Another ship coming home, another tale returning from the edge of the world. The sound was neither warlike nor peaceful, but something in between. The sound of a people learning to build, not burn. The North had begun to change its face. Behind every coin was a story. Behind every story, a memory of the sea. The Vikings, who once brought only fear, now carried connection. Between nations, between faiths, between strangers. Their ships no longer arrived only with fire, but with promise. And though the raids would never fully end, something gentler had begun to take hold, something that would spread far beyond the markets. To the east, new rivers waited. To the south, cities of marble shimmered under the sun. And soon, Viking ships would sail toward them, not as invaders, but as guests. The merchants of the north, bearing amber and iron, and stories of a land where winter never truly sleeps. The sea no longer marked an ending. By the 9th century, the Norse had threaded themselves into a vast, glittering web that stretched from the icy fjords of Norway to the sunlit markets of Constantinople. The same ships that once carried warriors now carried merchants, pilgrims, slaves, and dreams. Each voyage added a new strand, linking distant worlds with ropes of trade, faith, and rumor. And at the center of it all stood the North, no longer isolated, but connected to everything. The routes began simply. A merchant might sail east from Birka or Gotland, cross the Baltic Sea, and follow the great rivers inland. Each river became a road, and each road a story. The Neva led to Ladoga, Ladoga to Novgorod, and from there the Volkhov and Dnieper stretched toward the heart of the continent. Where others saw wilderness, the Vikings saw opportunity. Wide waterways glinting under northern light, forests rich with fur and iron, villages eager to trade. They called themselves the Rus, a name that may have come from the Old Norse roda, meaning rowing men. They rowed everywhere. Their boats slid silently through misty marshlands and narrow channels lined with birch and pine. They traded with Finns, Slavs, and Balts, exchanging honey, wax, and furs for weapons, cloth, and silver. Wherever they stopped, they built wooden forts, market posts, and temples that blended Nordic and Slavic design. Every post became a new knot in the web of the north. The Viking merchants brought with them not just goods, but stories. They spoke of kingdoms that glowed beneath desert suns, of towers of white marble and domes of gold. They carried coins from Baghdad, beads from Persia, silks from Byzantium. The most precious of all was silver, the lifeblood of Viking trade. Arab dirhams passed from hand to hand until they reached the cold shores of Sweden, where they were buried in hoards that still glimmer beneath the soil today. More than 100,000 such coins have been found, proof of a connection that spanned half the world. In markets like Staraya Ladoga and Novgorod, tongues and cultures mixed freely. A Norseman might haggle with a Slavic trader in broken phrases of both languages. A woman from Finland might wear a pendant of Thor's hammer beside a Byzantine cross. Faith was as fluid as the rivers they followed. Trade was the only creed everyone shared. Each market was a world in miniature, loud, crowded, and alive with possibility. Traveling south, some Vikings followed the Volga River leading toward the Caspian Sea and the Caliphate beyond. Others took the Dnieper, whose rapids roared through the forests like angry gods. They carried goods across portages, dragging their ships overland on wooden rollers, sweating under the summer sun. At each bend in the river, they left something of themselves. A rune carved into bark, a bead fallen into mud, a word borrowed by a local tongue. By the time they reached the Black Sea, the north had already seeped into the south. In Byzantium, the Vikings were both admired and feared. They called it Miklagard, the great city. Its walls gleamed with mosaics, its markets overflowed with spices, jewels, and silk. Here, the Norse traded furs and slaves for luxury goods unimaginable back home. Many stayed, joining the Varangian Guard, an elite corps sworn to protect the Byzantine emperors. They carried their axes not as raiders now, but as royal guards, their loyalty bought with gold and glory. In the shadow of Hagia Sophia, the songs of the north echoed softly in foreign tongues. Meanwhile, back in Scandinavia, news of these distant adventures drifted home like smoke on the wind. Men spoke of rivers wider than fjords, of cities where day never cooled, of markets where gold was so common it lost its wonder. The idea of the world itself changed. The north was no longer a lonely frontier, but a participant in a global exchange of goods, ideas, and blood. With trade came writing. The Norse began carving rune stones not just for the dead, but for the living, memorials to those who had gone east with the Rus. Some spoke of men who died in battle, others of merchants who prospered and returned home. Each rune was a fragment of a life stretched between worlds. Each inscription shimmered with pride, proof that the sea and the rivers had carried their names far beyond the reach of their ancestors. But this great web was not without shadow. Among the goods traded along the rivers were also people. The Vikings dealt in slaves, captured in raids or sold by other tribes. To them, slavery was not cruelty, but currency, an accepted part of the world they knew. Men and women taken from the British Isles or Eastern Europe were sold in the markets of the East, their lives transformed by a few silver coins. It is an uncomfortable truth, but an essential one. The Viking network connected not only commerce and culture, but suffering too. Even their progress came with cost. Yet, through all of it, there remained a sense of awe, a feeling that the North, once shrouded in darkness, had reached out and touched the wider world. Every new route, every market, every rune carved upon stone wove another thread into the tapestry. The web held firm because it was built not by kings, but by countless unnamed sailors, traders, and dreamers whose courage outlasted their names. At night, along the quiet banks of the Dnieper, a campfire flickered beside a Viking ship pulled up on the shore. The men sat wrapped in furs, staring into the flames. Around them stretched a world both alien and familiar. Strange constellations above, the smell of foreign trees, the whisper of the river. Someone hummed a song from home, soft and slow, a memory carried thousands of miles from the sea. The wind stirred the embers, and for a moment it almost felt as though the North itself were breathing through them. The web they wove was invisible, but it would never vanish. Even when the last ships had rotted and the rivers changed course, its strands would remain, in words, in blood, in memory, and from those threads would rise new cities, new kingdoms, and new stories that would carry the Viking spirit long after the sails were gone. The rivers of the East did more than carry goods. They carried destiny. By the mid-9th century, the Norse traders known as the Rus had followed those rivers so far and so deep that they began to shape the lands they once merely passed through. Their oars carved history into the water. They were no longer just guests in foreign markets. They were becoming rulers, bridge builders, and founders of new realms. The web of the North was tightening into something permanent. Their world began around Lake Ladoga, where the long grey waters met the forests of what is now northwestern Russia. Here, Viking merchants and local Slavs traded, feasted, and sometimes fought. From Ladoga, the Volkhov River flowed south toward the fertile plains, and along it, the Norse built Aldingjuborg, a fortified trading post that became the first heartbeat of the Rus. Later came Novgorod, the new fortress, where wooden walls rose above the riverbanks and smoke curled from hundreds of hearths. Its markets rang with voices from the Baltic, the steppe, and the south. The Russes were not conquerors in the old sense. They did not invade with armies so much as insert themselves into existing rhythms of trade and politics. They offered order where there was chaos, protection where there was fear. The Slavic tribes, weary of constant warfare, began to invite these foreigners to rule and mediate. And so, legend says, they called upon a Norse chieftain named Rurik. Rurik came, perhaps from Denmark or Sweden, with his kin and warriors. He settled in Novgorod around 862 AD and began to rule not as a raider, but as a lawgiver. His followers called themselves the Rus, and from his name and his lineage would rise the first dynasty of what would one day become Russia. When Rurik died, his kinsman Oleg took command, pushing farther south along the great rivers, binding Slavic tribes under one banner. In time, he reached the steep hills above the Dnieper and built a new city there, naming it Kiev. From the high bluffs of Kiev, Oleg could see the Dnieper stretching endlessly toward the south, where the river met the Black Sea, and beyond it, Byzantium, the richest city on earth. The merchants of the Ruses dreamed of reaching it, of trading fur for silk, wax for wine, amber for gold. But between them and that dream lay a chain of deadly rapids, rocks, and whirlpools that could tear a ship to pieces. To pass through, the men had to unload their cargo, drag their boats overland, and pray to every god they knew. They did it anyway, because that is what the North had taught them: endurance. In the sound of oars scraping against wood, in the smell of tar and sweat and pine, there was a sense of purpose. Each stroke of the oar brought them closer to Miklagard, the great city, known to others as Constantinople. To reach it was to stand at the edge of the world and find that the world did not end. The emperors of Byzantium looked upon these northern visitors with suspicion and fascination. The Russes were taller, fairer, louder, their speech harsh, their customs strange. Yet their discipline impressed even the hardened soldiers of the East. They fought in tight ranks, shield against shield, fearless and silent. So formidable were they that the Byzantine emperors began to recruit them as bodyguards, the legendary Varangian Guard. Clad in chain mail and bearing long axes, these Norsemen became symbols of incorruptible loyalty. They swore oaths upon their weapons, and for centuries their descendants would guard the emperor's thrones. Meanwhile, back in Kiev, trade flourished. Ships from the Baltic brought northern goods, furs, honey, wax, and slaves. From the south came silk, glass, spices, and the subtle scent of incense. Markets spilled out along the riverbanks. Kiev became a meeting place of worlds, pagan and Christian, Nordic and Slavic, northern frost and southern fire. Each morning, the bells of the Byzantine merchants rang beside the chants of Norsemen calling upon Thor. Faith here was a language of convenience. The Russes built wooden temples to Odin and Freya, but they also built small chapels to the Christian god, curious about his promise of eternal peace. They carved runes and made the sign of the cross. They drank from cups engraved with both hammers and crucifixes. They lived in the space between, not choosing sides, but learning from both. Among the Norse, Princess Olga would later emerge as one of the first to accept Christianity, decades before her people would follow. But even then, her conversion was as political as it was spiritual, a way to align the Rus with the great powers of Byzantium. Religion, like trade, was another kind of alliance. By the 10th century, the rivers were alive with movement. Boats passed each other endlessly, some filled with grain and hides, others with soldiers, emissaries, or pilgrims. At night, the fires of their camps shimmered along the water like stars fallen to earth. The smell of tar mixed with roasting meat. Songs in a dozen languages rose and blended with the rush of the current. It was no longer possible to say where one culture ended and another began. The Rus, the Slavs, the Greeks, the Norse, all were threads in the same river. Even in Scandinavia, people began to speak of the road to the east as if it were a holy path. Young men left home to seek fortune in Novgorod or Kiev, dreaming of silk, silver, and adventure. Families carved rune stones to remember them, their names followed by the simple phrase, "He traveled east with the Rus." Some returned rich, others never came back at all, but all were part of the same quiet migration that tied the north to the heart of civilization. As generations passed, the Russes forgot their seafaring origins. They became rulers, farmers, monks, traders. The Norse tongue softened into Slavic speech. The old gods gave way to new. But in their faces, in the pale eyes, the strong hands, the love of wide rivers, the memory of the North endured. Even centuries later, when the chroniclers wrote the first histories of Russia, they still began with Rurik and Oleg, with the ships on the Dnieper, with the oath of the Varangians under the Byzantine sun. The story that began with fire and frost now flowed quietly through time like a river, still northern at its heart, but changed forever by the warmth of the south. The Vikings had become something new, not just wanderers, not just traders, but builders of nations. And though their ships would one day fall silent, the current they set in motion would keep moving, east, always east, toward the light of the rising sun. Back in the cold heart of Scandinavia, The rivers may have carried away many men, but power never truly left the homeland. As the silver from trade flowed north, it reshaped the old world that had once been simple, scattered, and free. Small villages bound by kinship began to yield to chieftains, jarls, men of influence, whose wealth was measured not only in land or cattle, but in followers, ships, and honor. The age of the wandering seafarer was fading, and in its place, the age of kings was quietly dawning. For centuries, the North had lived without crowns. Each valley had its leader, each fjord its own law, and every man with courage and luck could rise to command. Power was personal, earned through strength, generosity, and the ability to protect one's people. When disputes arose, they were settled in open-air assemblies called the Thing, where free men gathered to speak, vote, and swear oaths beneath the open sky. Law was not imposed from above. It was spoken aloud, remembered, and renewed by the voices of the people themselves. But as trade grew and wealth concentrated, the balance began to shift. A few men possessed more silver, more ships, and more loyal warriors than any before. They built great halls with carved pillars and feasts that lasted for days. They gave gifts lavishly, arm rings, swords, even land, binding men to them through gratitude and debt. These jarls became something new, kings in all but name. Among them rose one whose ambition outshone the rest. Harald Fairhair, a young chieftain of Norway. Legend says that he vowed not to cut or comb his hair until he had united all of Norway under his rule. For 10 long years, he fought rival jarls, crossing mountains and seas, burning, raiding, and bargaining, until at last he stood alone, as king. When he finally washed and cut his hair, it gleamed like gold, and the people called him Harald Fairhair, the first king of Norway. Whether the tale is myth or memory hardly matters. It captures a truth about the time. The Norse world was changing, bound less by kin and more by crown. Loyalty, once owed to family or village, was now owed to a single ruler, whose reach extended farther than any had before. Across the sea, similar changes took root. In Denmark, Gorm the Old and his son Harald Bluetooth began to consolidate scattered tribes into one kingdom. They raised great earthen mounds and stone runestones to proclaim their power. The gelling stones, carved in runes that still survive today, spoke of kings and faith, of a people both proud and uncertain. On them, Harald Bluetooth declared that he had united the Danes and made them Christian, a sign of how politics and religion were already beginning to intertwine. In Sweden, the same transformation unfolded more slowly. The Swedes looked both east and west, balancing trade and conquest, while their kings ruled from places like Uppsala, where ancient temples glowed with sacrificial fires. The smell of blood and incense hung in the air as worshippers offered horses and oxen to the gods, their prayers rising in the smoke. It was a world still half pagan, half political, straddling 2 ages. These new kings were not distant monarchs in marble halls. They were men of flesh and weather, as much at home on a ship as on a throne. They feasted beside their warriors, shared in their victories, and joined them in battle. Their crowns were not of gold, but of reputation, fragile, brilliant, and easily lost. To rule was to walk a narrow road between generosity and fear. Each king needed his horde, a band of loyal retainers bound by oath. These men were warriors, advisors, and companions, rewarded with gifts and land in return for their loyalty. The hall of a king was a world unto itself, a place of laughter, mead, songs, and the occasional brawl. Skalds sang of valor and fate. Musicians played harps and flutes until dawn. A single spark of insult could ignite bloodshed, but beneath it all was a deep sense of unity, of shared purpose in an uncertain world. With kingship came order, but also loss. The freedom of the old days, when a man could sail wherever he pleased, owing allegiance only to his own courage, began to fade. Now there were taxes to pay, armies to serve in, and laws written by hands other than one's own. The spirit of independence that had carried the Vikings across oceans met its quiet rival, civilization. Yet even within this new structure, the old ways lingered. In many villages, the thing still met each summer. Farmers still debated law, spoke their grievances, and settled disputes as they always had. The king might rule from afar, but the land remained loyal to its rhythm, sowing, harvest, and the long winter between. Power reshaped faith as well. Kings began to claim divine favor, tracing their lineages back to Odin himself. Temples stood beside early churches, each vying for the same souls. To the common people, it was less a war of gods than a negotiation. Which deity offered more in return for loyalty? Thor's hammer or Christ's cross? Sometimes both hung around the same neck, side by side, glinting in the firelight. The songs of the skalds changed too. Where once they sang of lone heroes and faraway raids, now they praised kings, their victories, and their wisdom. Poetry became propaganda, yet still carried the same slow rhythm, half dream, half history. To listen to a skald was to drift between fact and faith, to feel that every word was part of something eternal. From the high cliffs of Norway to the fertile fields of Denmark, the North was taking shape. A new kind of unity was emerging, not born of fear or fire, but of structure, ambition, and vision. The Vikings were no longer just wanderers on the sea. They were builders of nations, writers of law, founders of dynasties. And yet, beyond the edge of every kingdom, the ocean still shimmered, whispering of freedom. That whisper would not be silenced, for even as kings rose and thrones were carved, there were still those who preferred the sound of waves to the sound of rule. They would sail again, not for war this time, but for something quieter, a home beyond the horizon. The age of settlements. Not everyone was made for kingdoms. As crowns rose and borders hardened, some men and women looked west, to the sea, to the horizon, to freedom. They had grown up in a world of shifting loyalties and growing power, but their hearts still beat to an older rhythm, one of open waves, self-reliance, and quiet defiance. For them, the new order of kings felt like a net closing around the spirit of the North, and so they slipped through its holes and sailed away. It began with small voyages, farmers, traders, and exiles, leaving Norway's crowded fjords in search of untouched land. They followed rumors carried by fishermen and merchants, islands of grass beyond the storms, where sheep could graze and no king's hand could reach. By the late 9th century, they had found them, the Faroe Islands, lonely and windswept, and farther still, a land of deep valleys and black sands that shimmered under the midnight sun. They called it Iceland. The first settlers arrived around 874 AD, led by a man named Ingolfur Arnarson, who threw his carved wooden pillars into the sea and swore to settle wherever they washed ashore. They landed on a bay surrounded by smoke and steam, the breath of nearby hot springs. There they built their homes, and the place became known as Reykjavik, the smoky bay. Even now, its name carries the warmth of that first fire lit against the wind. Life in Iceland was hard but free. The settlers built turf houses into the hillsides, their walls thick with moss and wool to keep out the cold. They planted barley, raised sheep and horses, fished the icy seas, and cut driftwood from distant shores. There were no kings here, no armies, no taxes, only families bound by custom and law. Each summer, the chieftains and farmers gathered at a great open-air assembly called the Althing, one of the earliest parliaments in history. There, under wide skies, they recited laws, settled disputes, and recounted the genealogies of their ancestors. not from parchment, but from memory. The Icelanders carried their history in their voices. They had no temples of stone, so they built temples of story. Every night by the hearth, they told tales of gods and heroes, of Thor's hammer and Odin's wisdom, of voyages across seas, both real and imagined. And slowly, these stories began to merge with their own, the sagas of men and women who braved storms, betrayal, and fate itself to carve out a life in exile. Some sailed even farther. From Iceland's western shores, the sea stretched endless and gray, until at last it touched another land, colder, harsher, yet alive with promise. Greenland, they called it, perhaps out of hope, perhaps out of irony. It was discovered by Eric the Red, a man both fierce and visionary, exiled from Iceland for manslaughter. He sailed west, found the new land, and returned to Iceland to tell others of its beauty. Many followed him, carrying livestock, tools, and dreams. They built their homes along the fjords, where summer's brief warmth allowed for hay and grazing. In time, whole families lived there, trading ivory and furs with ships that still dared the crossing. For 2 centuries, they endured, their farms clinging to the edge of ice and memory. Every year, as winter closed in, the Greenlanders gathered in their halls, listening to the wind howl across the empty plains. The candles flickered, the walls creaked, and for a moment it felt as though the entire world had shrunk to a single fire. They were the farthest west any Norseman had ever lived, yet still, for some, the horizon was not far enough. Among those restless hearts was Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red. Born in Greenland, raised on stories of his father's exile and courage, Leif grew up staring west into the unknown. He listened to sailors' tales of land beyond the fog, rich and forested, untouched by frost. Around the year 1000 AD, he set sail, guided by nothing but stars and instinct. Weeks later, his ship touched a new shore. He called it Vinland, the land of wine, perhaps for the wild grapes that grew there or the sweet promise of abundance. Leif built a small settlement, explored the forests, and marveled at the rivers that did not freeze. It was a place of peace, but it was too far, too hard to reach, too distant to sustain. After a few short years, the settlement was abandoned. Yet in that brief voyage, the Norse became the first Europeans known to have reached the continent that would one day be called America. The sagas would remember it, not as conquest, but as wonder. Meanwhile, back in Iceland and Greenland, life carried on at a slower rhythm. The settlers learned patience, learned to listen to the land. They read the skies for storms, the sheep for signs of sickness, the sea for the return of ships that might never come. They wrote little, but remembered everything. It was from these memories, these long winter nights of storytelling, that the Icelandic sagas were born. Written down centuries later, they preserved the texture of life itself, the smell of wet wool, the crunch of snow underfoot, the sound of gulls over the fjord. Through them, the Viking voice never truly fell silent. To live in those distant colonies was to live between courage and loneliness. The ocean was both protector and prison. Ships might arrive once a year, or never again. Families counted time not in months, but in seasons, the length of a lamb's fleece, the thickness of ice, the return of daylight after endless dark. Yet even in that isolation, they thrived. They farmed, sang, traded, and raised children who knew no other home but the edge of the world. Their faith, too, evolved. Some still prayed to Odin and Thor. Others, especially those in Greenland, built small churches and whispered Latin prayers beside the old runes. The two faiths coexisted as easily as night and dawn, one fading, one rising, both necessary. For the Norse had learned something their gods never taught them. Survival often required compromise. By the 11th century, the North had reached its farthest frontier. From Denmark to Vinland, Viking sails had touched almost every shore the wind could carry them to, and yet It was in the quiet farms of Iceland and the lonely fjords of Greenland that their story found its gentlest form, not of conquest, but of endurance. Here, the fire that once burned for war now burned for warmth, for family, for memory. Here, the Viking spirit became something softer, less about fame, more about belonging, and as the old explorers watched their children grow, they must have felt that strange, familiar pull again, the tension between home and horizon. The same restlessness that had once driven them across oceans now lived only as a faint ache, like a heartbeat felt through ice. The sea still whispered, but fewer listened. The age of discovery was giving way to the age of story, the saga and the sea. When the oars grew still and the sails hung quiet, the Vikings turned inward. The sea that had once carried them to faraway lands now lived inside their stories, deep, endless, and alive. As the last explorers settled into farms and families, a new kind of voyage began, one that required no ships at all. It was a journey through memory, through story, through the rhythm of words that echoed like waves against the shore. In the evenings, when the wind howled across the plains of Iceland or snow drifted against the walls of turf houses, families gathered around the hearth. The air smelled of smoke and sheep's wool. The fire hissed softly as damp wood burned. Outside the world was dark and frozen, but inside, voices rose, one speaking, others listening, all breathing in time with the tale. This was how history survived in the North, not on paper, but on tongues. Each story was a living thing, passed from voice to voice like a flame that never died. The storytellers were known as skalds, poets, chroniclers, memory keepers. They carried the past in verses so precise that a single misplaced word could ruin the rhythm. Their poems praised kings, mourned the dead, celebrated harvests, and warned of fate. They used kennings, poetic riddles that turned language into art. A ship became a sea steed. Blood was battle sweat. The sun was the sky's candle. Their words transformed the ordinary into something immortal. In the sagas, even silence had meaning. A pause before a word could say as much as the word itself. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, like the creak of a ship in calm water. And in that rhythm, people found comfort. After all the wars and wanderings, the Norse had discovered a gentler form of strength, the power to remember. The earliest sagas told of gods and giants, the Eddas, the great mythic poems of the North. In them lived the whole Norse cosmos. Odin, wise and weary, Thor, fierce and loyal, Loki, clever and cruel, Freya, radiant and sorrowful. The gods felt human, flawed, mortal in emotion if not in body. They laughed, deceived, loved, and feared their own end. Their doom was written in the prophecy of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when fire and frost would meet, and the world would begin anew. Even destruction to them was a cycle, not an ending. But alongside these divine tales came new stories, the Islending Asögur, the sagas of men and women who had lived not in Asgard, but in the real world. They told of feuds and family honor, of love and revenge, of law and blood. Heroes like Grettir the Strong, who fought monsters and his own loneliness. Women like Gudrun Osvifsdottir, whose beauty and bitterness shaped the fate of generations. Their struggles were not about conquest, but conscience. They were stories of endurance, the same virtue that had defined their people for centuries. Unlike the epics of other civilizations, the sagas had no clear heroes or villains. They spoke of people as they were, proud, flawed, and bound by fate. A man could be brave and cruel, generous and reckless, wise yet doomed. In this honesty lay their quiet beauty. They taught that life was neither tragedy nor triumph, but a series of choices made under an indifferent sky. Even the gods, in their wisdom, could not escape what was woven for them. For the Norse, Storytelling was not just entertainment, it was law, history, and faith all at once. A tale could settle disputes or ruin reputations. A verse could immortalize a name. To be forgotten was the truest death, worse than the sword, and so the skalds made sure no one vanished completely. Every life, no matter how small, could be sung into eternity. By the 12th century, monks and scholars in Iceland began to write these stories down. They used vellum, stretched calfskin, and black ink made from soot. Their pens scratched slowly across the page, preserving voices that had once lived only in the air. The poetic Edda and the prose Edda, recorded by Snorri Sturluson, became the great vessels of Norse myth, fragile yet eternal. The old gods survived not through worship, but through words. And though the North had long since turned Christian, the sagas kept a memory of the old faith, not as rebellion, but as heritage. When a scribe copied a line about Odin's ravens, he may have whispered a prayer to Christ. When he described Thor's hammer striking the serpent, he may have crossed himself. But still, he wrote, he could not let those stories die, for even faith changes slower than memory. The sea returned again and again in these stories, not as enemy, but as witness. It was there in every voyage, every exile, every prayer shouted into the wind. The Norse imagination was forever tied to water, its rhythm, its danger, its promise. To them, the sea was not a border, but a bridge, connecting not just lands, but generations. Even those who never sailed felt it in their bones. The waves were in their language, their poetry, their dreams. Sometimes, in the quiet of winter, the old sailors would step outside and listen to the wind. They could almost hear it, the faint creak of oars, the distant hum of voices carried across centuries. Their sons no longer raided or roamed, but they still built boats, still watched the horizon, still felt that pull in the chest when the tide rose. It was as if the sea itself remembered them. Through the sagas, the Vikings achieved what their swords never could: immortality without conquest. Their names lived in the mouths of children, their deeds in the minds of strangers who had never seen their shores. The fire that once burned in their halls now burned quietly in words. And even as kingdoms rose and fell, those words remained, patient, enduring, unbroken. Every time a story was told, a bit of the old world returned. Every time a rune was traced, a whisper of the North stirred again. The sagas became the soul of a people who had once conquered the world, and now conquered time itself. And far beyond the farms and the fjords, beyond even Greenland's icy cliffs, one last echo of that restless spirit would rise. A voyage toward the unknown, where myth and memory would meet again on the edge of the sea. The Danelaw dream, the sea that once carried raiders, now carried settlers. By the late 9th century, the Vikings had not only touched the shores of England, they had begun to stay. The raids that had once come and gone with the tide grew into something more permanent. Fields were plowed where fires had once burned. Wooden halls rose on old battlefields. Children were born who would never see the fjords of their ancestors, yet still spoke their language in whispers by the hearth. This was the beginning of the Danelaw, a kingdom not written in maps, but in coexistence. England in those days was a fractured land, a mosaic of small kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. The Saxons ruled much of it, but their unity was fragile. The Norse saw opportunity in division. Led by chieftains like Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba, the great heathen army swept across the land in 865 AD. But this invasion was different. It was not a raid to burn and leave. It was a campaign to rule, to farm, to build. Behind the warriors came their families, their craftsmen, and their gods. At first, the conquest was brutal. Towns like York fell, abbeys were looted, Saxon kings were captured and slain, but once the dust settled, something remarkable happened. The Northmen did not simply destroy, they adapted. They rebuilt what they had burned, renamed the places they claimed, and began to sow seeds, both literal and cultural. The line between Viking and Saxon blurred with every harvest. The Danelaw stretched across the northern and eastern parts of England, from Yorkshire down through East Anglia, a vast region under Norse law and Norse custom. Here, the language of the land changed. Old English absorbed Old Norse words until they mingled like water and wine. Sky, egg, knife, husband, window, all gifts from the north. Even today, the echoes of that union linger in every sentence. The Norse settlers brought with them their sense of law, pragmatic, communal, spoken rather than written. Disputes were settled in open-air assemblies called things, just as in the old homeland. Land was divided fairly among farmers, and even women could hold property and speak in court. In a world still ruled by kings and bishops, this simple justice felt strangely modern. It was as though the raw air of the fjords had followed them across the sea, carrying with it the idea that freedom could survive in any soil if tended well enough. In the towns, markets thrived. Jorvik, the Viking name for York, became one of the richest cities in England. Its streets were lined with workshops and homes of timber and clay. Blacksmiths forged blades beside weavers and jewelers. The smell of smoke and ale filled the air, mingling with the tang of the nearby river. Coins minted in Jorvik bore both Latin and Norse inscriptions, one face for the Saxons, one for the North. Every trade, every conversation, every marriage pulled the two cultures tighter together. Children grew up bilingual, their songs mixing Norse rhythm with Saxon melody. They wore brooches shaped like Thor's hammer beside small silver crosses. Festivals celebrated both the old gods and the new saints. Even faith itself seemed to settle into uneasy peace. Priests preached in wooden churches beside runestones, and neither side seemed eager to erase the other. Perhaps both understood what time already knew, that one faith would fade into the other soon enough, but not yet. Still, peace was fragile. To the south, Wessex stood defiant under King Alfred the Great, who saw the Norse not as neighbors, but as invaders. He fought them fiercely, driving them back with patience and strategy rather than strength. After years of struggle, a treaty was signed. The Treaty of Wedmore, dividing the land into two realms, the Saxon south and the Norse north. The border ran along the old Roman road called Watling Street, a line between two worlds that had once shared only bloodshed. For a time, it worked. Trade flowed between them, peace held by necessity. But no treaty can stop the slow erosion of identity. The Danelaw was not a fortress, it was a bridge, and on that bridge both sides changed each other. Saxon kings borrowed Norse words and customs. Norse jarls adopted Saxon laws and titles. The Northmen, who once scoffed at kingship, now ruled as earls beneath them. Even Alfred, once the enemy, admired their craftsmanship and learning. History was turning them into something neither fully Norse nor Saxon, but English. Generations passed. The children of raiders became farmers, their grandchildren merchants. Some still carved runes on wood, but most now used Latin script. The sagas of Odin and Thor gave way to the parables of Christ, yet the spirit beneath them remained the same: courage, endurance, fate. On cold winter nights, the fires still burned bright, and men still spoke of the sea as though it were a living thing. Old habits die slowly, especially in the north. By the time the 10th century dawned, the lines between the Danelaw and the Saxon realms were fading. Kings married across borders, merchants traded freely, and armies began to march together instead of apart. The dream of conquest, had become the dream of stability. But stability, too, has its cost. The wilder, freer soul of the Viking world, the one that had crossed oceans and defied kings, began to quiet. The roar of the sea became a murmur in the distance. And yet, for all its fading, the Danelaw left a mark that would never vanish. It changed not only England, but the very idea of what the North could be, not just a land of warriors, but of law, community, and compromise. The Vikings had learned to rule, and the Saxons had learned to adapt. Together, they built something lasting, a culture forged in both iron and understanding. If you walk through Yorkshire today, or the old streets of York, the names still carry the memory. Endings like by and thorpe, Norse words for village and farm. They are whispers of that long ago peace when the sea brought not only war, but roots. The Danelaw dream did not last, but it never truly died either. It lingered in the language, in the laws, in the faces of the people, a quiet testament to the time when North and South met and found a way to share the same sky. The cross and the raven, the world of the Vikings had always been full of gods. They were everywhere, in storms and stones, in rivers and iron, in every unseen space between life and death. But now, another god had come to join them. He did not roar like Thor or wander like Odin. He spoke softly through priests and parchment, through bells that rang at dawn, through crosses carved on doorposts beside old runes. And slowly, almost gently, the North began to change. Faith, for the Vikings, had never been rigid. It was a conversation, not a command. A man could call upon Odin before battle and still thank Christ for a good harvest. For generations the Norse had met new gods with curiosity rather than fear. They did not abandon the old ways all at once. They simply made room at the table. The hammer and the cross hung side by side, two symbols, two worlds, sharing the same breath. The first Christians came not with armies, but with words. Missionaries traveled north from Francia and England, carrying books bound in leather and hope written in ink. They spoke of peace, redemption, and life everlasting, ideas that sounded strange to people who had always believed that glory was won only in death. Some laughed, others listened. A few were baptized, not because they believed, but because it pleased their new allies. Faith was diplomacy now. In Denmark, the seeds took root first. King Harald Bluetooth, son of Gorm the Old, saw both opportunity and inevitability in this new religion. He built churches, raised runestones that declared he had made the Danes Christian, and balanced the old and the new with careful skill. On the Jellingstone, his name is carved beside the image of Christ, arms outstretched, surrounded by knots of Norse design. Even in stone, the two faiths intertwined, as though one had grown from the other. In Norway, the change came with more struggle. Olaf Tryggvason, a king fierce and restless, took baptism in England and returned home with both a sword and a cross. He built churches where temples once stood, and those who refused to convert were offered a choice, faith or exile. Yet even his zeal could not erase centuries of tradition overnight. Many bowed to the cross in public and still whispered prayers to Thor in private. In the longhouses, the old idols were hidden in corners, their faces covered but not forgotten. Iceland, as always, chose its own path. When word of Christianity reached the island, the chieftains gathered at the Althing to decide whether the old gods or the new should rule. Voices clashed for days. Thunder rolled in the distance, as if the heavens themselves were listening. Finally, one man, the law speaker Thorgeir Torkelson, lay down beneath his cloak in silence. He remained there for a full day and night, thinking. When he rose, he spoke simply, "All Iceland shall have one law and one faith. We shall be Christian." And so it was decided, not by war, but by consensus. Yet even then, the people were allowed to sacrifice in secret for a time. to let the transition feel like twilight instead of eclipse. For the Norse, conversion was not the death of belief, but its transformation. The world had always been sacred, only the language changed. The old gods had lived in the wind and the trees. Now Christ lived there too. The festivals of Yule and Midsummer continued, though the prayers were different. The people still carved runes, still lit fires, still told stories of courage and fate. In truth, Christianity in the North never erased the pagan spirit. It absorbed it, softened it, baptized it in frost and flame. Many of the early churches were built on the very sites where temples once stood. Sometimes the builders even reused the same stones, as if to honor what came before. In those sanctuaries, you could still feel the echo of the old ways, the smell of pine, the hum of the wind, the sense that somewhere above the crossbeams, Odin might still be watching. Faith layered itself like paint upon wood, each coat showing through the next. The skalds adapted too. Where once they had sung of Odin's wisdom, they now praised Christ's mercy. Yet the tone remained the same, calm, reverent, touched by melancholy. The rhythm of their poetry still carried the pulse of the North, slow, deliberate, enduring. In the Eddas you can feel it, the overlap, the tension, the grace of a culture in mid-transformation. Even Snorri Sturluson, writing long after the temples had fallen, preserved the pagan myths not as blasphemy, but as inheritance. He knew that memory, like faith, cannot be ordered. It can only be tended. The raven banners that once flew before Viking armies were lowered, and in their place crosses rose. But if you looked closely, the same wind carried both. The same courage that once drove men to raid and explore now drove them to build and believe. The same stubborn endurance that had faced the sea now faced salvation. Their gods had changed, but their hearts had not. By the 11th century, Scandinavia was Christian in name, yet something older lingered in its silence. The churches of stone stood where wooden halls had once been, their bells echoing across the fjords. But outside, under the vast northern sky, the air still carried that ancient feeling, that the world itself was alive, mysterious, and watching. Perhaps that is why the transition was so complete, yet so peaceful. Because the North had never feared mystery. It had only ever feared forgetting. And as the centuries turned, the hammer and the cross, once symbols of rivalry, became threads of the same fabric. The enduring weave of a people who had learned to carry both faith and memory across the storms of time. Leaf and the edge of the world. The sea had always whispered to the north, and some still listened. Even after kings ruled the homeland and churches stood where temples once smoked, there remained those who could not ignore the horizon. Among them was Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, born in exile, raised on stories of courage and cold, restless for something that no kingdom could give. In him lived the old fire of the wanderers, that quiet conviction that there was always more to see, more to know, more to endure. By the year 1000 AD, the world of the Vikings had reached its farthest edge. Iceland and Greenland, small islands of warmth surrounded by frozen possibility. Greenland's fjords shimmered in summer light, but beyond them, rumor spoke of land farther west, where the sea was gentler and trees grew thick and tall. Fishermen had glimpsed it through fog. Driftwood, unlike any from Greenland's coasts, had washed ashore. And so, as his father before him had once done, Leif built a ship, gathered a crew, and set his course toward the unknown. They set sail under a low sun, the wind sharp with salt and promise. The ocean stretched endlessly ahead, grey, rippling, ancient. For weeks they saw nothing but water and sky, their days marked only by the rhythm of rowing and the creak of wood. When storms rose, they prayed to both Christ and the old gods, unsure which one ruled these waters. Every dawn felt like the edge of the world, yet still they pressed on, guided by faith, memory, and the pull of something nameless. At last, land appeared, first as a shadow, then as green. It was nothing like Greenland's frozen coast. Here, the air was warm, the trees heavy with leaves, the rivers running deep and clear. The men waded ashore and stood silent, listening to the strange chorus of birds in the branches above. For the first time in generations, the Norse had found a world untouched by axe or altar. Leif called it Vinland, the land of wine, for the wild grapes that clung to the forest edges. They built small huts along the shore, using driftwood and turf. Smoke curled into the pale sky, the smell of fish and pine mingled in the wind. They explored cautiously, gathering fruit, hunting game, and marveling at how mild the air felt compared to the ice-bound north. Every night, they sat by their fires, whispering about how far they had come, farther than anyone from their world had ever dreamed. To them, it must have felt like stepping into myth, as though they had found the world before the flood, before memory. But paradise, even briefly found, is fragile. The settlers soon realized they were not alone. They encountered people already living there, the Skraelings, as the sagas called them. At first, there was curiosity, cautious trade, and wonder on both sides. But misunderstanding followed quickly, a quarrel over goods, a shouted word no one understood, an arrow loosed too soon, and peace vanished like mist at sunrise. The Norse, far from home and few in number, could not stay. They gathered their tools, their stories, their awe, and turned back toward the sea that had brought them here. Vineland faded behind them, swallowed by fog and distance. They returned to Greenland with tales of forests and fruit, of warmth and danger, of a place that seemed too perfect to belong to their world. Leif spoke little of the voyage afterward. Perhaps he knew that some discoveries are meant to be memories, not possessions. The sagas say he brought back timber and grapes, but what he truly brought home was something far greater. The knowledge that the world was wider than anyone had ever imagined. The Vinland settlement was small, short-lived, and forgotten by most, but the story endured, passed down through generations of Icelanders, written into sagas 2 centuries later. To those who heard it, Vinland became less a place and more an idea, the dream of what lies beyond sight, the proof that courage can outlive conquest. In that sense, Leif's voyage was the final chapter of the Viking Age, not its end in war, but its end in wonder. For centuries afterward, sailors still watched the western horizon from Greenland's cliffs, squinting for a glimpse of that green shore. None found it again. The sea kept its secret, as it always had, but the story remained, and in time it would travel farther than any ship, across centuries, into memory, and into the minds of those who would rediscover the new world half a millennium later. By then, the Vikings were gone. Their temples stood silent, their ships rotted into the earth. Yet through Leif's voyage, their spirit still moved, the same spirit that had carried them from Norway to Ireland, from Iceland to Byzantium, from myth to history. The sea had given them everything, and in return, they had given it their faith, their lives, and their longing. When the last fire burned low in Greenland, perhaps someone looked west one final time, toward that unseen coast, and whispered a prayer into the wind, a prayer not for conquest, but for memory, because every story, no matter how far it travels, must eventually find its way home. The North remembers. The sea grew quieter, the sails fewer. By the 11th century, the great age of voyages was passing into story. The ships that once shadowed every horizon now rested on the grass beside empty harbors. Axes hung on walls, traded for plows and prayer. But the North still breathed, not through conquest or kingship, but through craft, memory, and the slow pulse of everyday life. The Vikings had not vanished. They had simply changed their shape. Across Scandinavia, the sounds of war were replaced by softer ones. The ring of a hammer on bronze, the murmur of looms, the low hum of song. Blacksmiths still forged blades, but now they made hinges, buckles, and tools. Jewelry replaced armor. Rune stones rose beside churches, carved not to honor battle, but to remember family, a husband, a mother, a child. The language of strength had turned inward, gentler but no less proud. Walk through a Norse village in those quiet years, and you would still recognize much. Timber houses stood in clusters near fields and streams. Smoke rose from hearths. Goats bleated among the fences. The people worked as their ancestors had, sowing, herding, weaving, and trading when weather allowed. But their faces carried something new, a settled calm, the peace that comes after centuries of movement. The North, once restless, had learned to rest. The craft of the age reflected that calm. Woodcarvers shaped intricate spirals, vines, beasts, and interwoven knots on door frames and drinking horns. Every line seemed to speak of continuity, of one life merging into another. The urns style, named for a small church in Norway, captured this beauty perfectly. Slender animals curling in graceful patterns, their bodies both natural and eternal. Even in Christian art, the old language of form endured. A cross might still bear the curves of the Midgard serpent, and in its wood the faint scent of pine and sea lingered. Women, as always, were keepers of the home and heart. They spun wool into yarn, dyed it with moss and bark, and wove it into cloth of soft grey and deep red. Their hands remembered movements older than any kingdom. They brewed ale, dried fish, gathered herbs, and taught their children the stories that bound the past to the present. To the Norse, labor was never small. Every act, mending, carving, cooking, was part of the same faith, that life, tended carefully, was sacred. The world beyond the villages continued to turn. Kings ruled from stone halls now. Coins replaced barter. Latin crept into law. But for most, those changes were distant. The real world was still the farm, the family, the fjord. Each dawn brought the same rituals: feed the animals, light the hearth, check the nets. Evenings ended with quiet, children asleep, embers glowing, the sound of wind against the roof. In that rhythm lay the same endurance that had once driven ships across oceans. Old customs remained in secret corners. On midsummer nights, people still lit bonfires on the hills and leapt through the flames for luck. At Yule, they feasted through the darkest nights, decorating with evergreens and leaving food for spirits who wandered in the snow. The church bells might ring above them, but the earth still hummed the older tune. Faith, like time, moves slowly in the north. In towns like Roskilde, Trondheim, and Bergen, the traces of the sea remained strong. Shipbuilders still gathered by the water, crafting vessels smaller than the longships, but shaped with the same grace. Their tools were simple: axe, adze, chisel. Yet from them came designs so balanced that even centuries later, their curves would inspire shipwrights anew. To watch such a craftsman work was to see patience made visible, each strike of wood carrying memory. The Viking aesthetic, if one could call it that, was always honest. It did not separate beauty from function. A comb, a brooch, a sword pommel, all were made with the same devotion. Even when gold was scarce, skill was abundant. It was as if the Norse believed that making something well was its own kind of prayer. By now, the old gods had faded to legend, yet their presence lingered in language and habit. The days of the week still bore their names: Tuesday for Tyr, Thursday for Thor, Friday for Freya. Children learned them without thinking, unaware that they spoke the names of deities long gone. In this way, the old faith never truly died. It became grammar. 1,000 years later, the North would still whisper its myths each time someone named a day. And so life went on, slower, quieter, but not smaller. The sagas that once told of warriors now told of farmers and lovers, of land disputes and lost sheep, of the steady courage needed simply to endure winter. The Viking age of thunder had become an age of silence, and in that silence lay its truest strength. At the end of a long day, when the sun slid behind the mountains and the fjord turned to silver, a farmer might stand outside his door and listen. He would hear the same wind that had once filled the sails of his ancestors. The same sea still touched his land. The same stars still guided travelers somewhere far away. Perhaps for a moment he would feel both pride and melancholy, knowing that, though the world had changed, its heartbeat had not. The North remembered, not with monuments or kings, but with continuity. Every breath of smoke, every carved beam, every word spoken at the hearth carried the memory forward. History here was not written, it was lived. And as the night gathered and the lamps were lit, the faint glimmer of the sea beyond the hills still shimmered, as if reminding them that nothing is ever truly gone, only transformed. The age of kings and saints. The tide of history rose one final time for the North. After centuries of wandering and war, the Viking world reached its greatest height, not through chaos but through order. What had begun in small wooden boats now stretched across kingdoms, from Denmark to England, from Norway to the edge of the Baltic, and at the center of it all stood a man who ruled not as a raider, but as a king, Knut the Great. Under him, the Viking world found both its empire and its peace. Knut was born of both storm and silence. The son of a Danish king, he was raised among warriors and priests, between the old gods and the new faith. He learned early that power was not just taken, it was managed, balanced, maintained like a ship on rough waters. When his father, Sweyn Forkbeard, invaded England and claimed its crown, Knut followed. When Sweyn died suddenly, Knut stayed behind, determined to hold what his father had begun. In time, he did more than that. He mastered it. By 1016, after years of war and diplomacy, England bowed to him, not out of terror, but exhaustion. The endless Viking raids had turned into something almost lawful, a system of tribute and governance. Knut united the Danes and the Saxons under one rule, one law, one calm voice. He kept their languages, their customs, their faiths, blending them with the same patience that the sea blends river and salt. For the first time in history, a single Scandinavian crown ruled both the North Sea and the English shore. The empire he built was vast, but his rule was quiet. He did not need to shout. His presence was enough. Where his ancestors had burned, he rebuilt. Where they had taken, he gave back. He paid priests and poets alike, built churches beside old temples, and declared that justice, not vengeance, would keep his world together. In his halls, English lords and Norse jarls sat side by side, drinking from the same cups, swearing loyalty to the same king. If the Viking age had begun with fire, Knut's reign was its cool afterglow, the moment when the embers turned golden instead of red. In Winchester and Roskilde, bells rang for him. His name was spoken in Latin prayers and carved in runes on wooden beams. He sent gifts to the Pope, founded monasteries, and yet still honored the spirit of his forefathers. He understood what few rulers ever do, that faith and power are both kinds of navigation, and that calm hands steer longest. Yet even a great king cannot rule the sea. The story goes that Knut once commanded his throne to be placed upon the shore. As the tide came in, he lifted his hand and ordered the waves to stop. They did not. The water rose around his feet, cold and certain. He turned to his courtiers and said softly, "Let all men know how empty is the power of kings, for none may command the ocean but God." Whether true or not, the story endures, a fable of humility from a man who understood the limits of dominion. Under Knut, Scandinavia flourished. Trade flowed like lifeblood through its ports. Ships carried iron, wool, and wine between England, Denmark, and Norway. Merchants spoke in 3 tongues. Children learned to read both runes and Latin letters, and poets found new patrons in royal courts. The North was no longer an outpost at the world's edge. It was its own center, cultured, connected, confident. But empires, like seasons, never hold forever. When Sunat died in 1035, his sons fought for the throne, and his great realm splintered. England turned once more to its Saxon roots. Denmark and Norway drifted apart. The unity he had built dissolved like mist at dawn. Yet even in its fading, it left behind something luminous, the sense that the North had proven itself equal to any power on earth. In the decades that followed, Scandinavia remained rich in memory. Kings still rose and fell, but they were no longer conquerors. They were administrators, builders, saints. Olaf Haraldsson, known later as Saint Olaf, brought Christianity to Norway with both sword and sermon. He died in battle, and his body, legend said, did not decay. His grave became a shrine, and pilgrims came from far and wide to kneel before the relics of a man who had once been both warrior and missionary. The faith that had come from foreign shores was now truly theirs. The North, once wild, had sanctified itself. Even the sagas changed. They no longer glorified bloodshed, but redemption. They told of kings who dreamed of justice instead of conquest, of farmers who became saints by living honestly. The tone of the North shifted, still melancholic, still proud, but touched now with grace. And yet, beneath the churches and crowns, the old rhythm endured. Men still carved ships, still set sail for trade and pilgrimage, still sang of fate. They still believed that courage mattered more than comfort, that a name should outlive the flesh. Knut's empire may have fallen, but the idea behind it, that the North could lead without destroying, lingered for centuries. On a clear morning, along the Danish coast, one might have seen a fisherman watching the tide roll in, the same way Knut once did. The waves came and went, as they always had, unconcerned with kings. Above him, gulls circled, calling in a language older than runes. Perhaps, without knowing why, he whispered a small prayer, part to Christ, part to the sea, and felt, for a moment, that he belonged to something vast and eternal. The Viking world had reached its height, and though its power would fade, its spirit, that quiet mixture of endurance, reverence, and defiance, would never leave the North. The quiet decline. It did not end with a battle. No thunder, no fall of cities, no final blaze of glory. The Viking world, so fierce and vast, simply drifted away, like the tide pulling slowly from the shore. Its people did not vanish. They farmed, prayed, built, traded, but something within them grew still. The old fire that once demanded motion, that once sought the horizon, now flickered in memory alone. The age of the Vikings was ending, not with defeat, but with acceptance. The 12th century dawned with quieter sounds. Hammers struck stone for churches instead of swords for war. The oars that had beaten rhythm on the sea now rested beneath roofs of pine. The longships, once sleek and alive, lay overturned beside the fields, their hulls filled with hay or rainwater. Children played among them, unaware that these were the bones of an age. To them, the world had always been still, and the idea of setting sail into nothingness seemed impossible. Yet the old world was not forgotten, only softened. The sagas were still told, but they now belonged to history rather than life. The people who once lived them had become ancestors, half real, half myth. Men still carved runes, but more often they carved crosses above them. The same hands that once built temples to Thor now laid foundations for stone churches that reached toward the same sky. The faith had changed, but the longing for eternity had not. In towns that had once echoed with trade, silence took root. Rivers silted, harbors grew shallow, and forests reclaimed forgotten roads. The North was not dying, it was resting. Even prosperity quiets in time. The great merchants of Hedeby, Ribe, and Birka were gone, replaced by smaller markets, slower exchanges, humbler ambitions. The ships that did still sail carried wool and timber instead of warriors. The rhythm of the axe had become the rhythm of the plow, and for the first time in centuries, peace truly lasted. The people adjusted as they always had. They measured seasons instead of battles, watched the skies for weather instead of omens. A good harvest mattered more than a raid, a child's laughter more than a king's command. The fierce independence that once pushed them across oceans turned inward, a quiet resilience, a steadiness that would become the defining strength of the North for centuries to come. Yet in the quiet there lingered a shadow of longing. Old songs were still sung in winter halls, though fewer remembered their meanings. Sometimes, when a storm rose over the fjord, the elders would pause, listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in their doors. It sounded like oars in water, like sails snapping in the distance. They would smile faintly and tell the children, "That's the sea remembering." And the children, wide-eyed, would imagine ghostly ships sailing through the clouds, carrying their ancestors home. Across Europe, the world was changing. The Crusades had begun. Kingdoms rose and fell in waves. But Scandinavia watched from its cold distance, slower, older, content. Its kings still ruled, but their crowns no longer carried the weight of legend. They were administrators now, their glory bound in parchment rather than saga. Even the weapons changed. Swords lost their broad Viking shape, becoming slender, ceremonial, meant for knights rather than raiders. The North was no longer feared, it was respected, and perhaps quietly missed. In Iceland, the sagas were still being written, memories of an age now centuries past. Men and women whose ancestors had once known Leif and Eric wrote of them as if they were giants from another world. The ink dried, the vellum aged, but the stories endured. They were the last echoes of the Viking soul, preserved not in fire, but in patience. It is one of history's small mercies that the culture which began in conquest ended in storytelling, for in the end it is words, not wars, that survive. The sea, too, seemed to understand. It still lapped against the same shores, still whispered the same songs to the stones. But it no longer called for blood or bravery. It simply existed, eternal, vast, indifferent. Perhaps that is why the Vikings loved it so deeply. They saw in it a reflection of themselves, restless, enduring, impossible to truly own. Even when the last longship rotted to dust, the ocean kept their memory, every wave a fragment of their reflection. So the North grew still. Its winters came and went, its fields yielded, its stories lengthened. The descendants of raiders became monks, traders, sailors, craftsmen, people of peace, people of memory. The gods of war were gone, but their courage remained, tempered by gentleness. And though centuries would pass and new empires would rise, the world would never forget the people who once made the sea their road and the sky their map. If you had stood on a Norwegian cliff at twilight, centuries after the last voyage, and looked out across the water, you might have felt it. A silence not of absence, but of completion. The sea shimmered gold in the dying light, and far away the horizon blurred into the clouds. For a moment it might have seemed that the world had folded back upon itself, that the past and present were one endless, peaceful tide. The Viking age had gone to sleep, and the world was a little quieter for it. Echoes of the North. Even after the sails were gone, the Vikings never truly disappeared. Their ships had faded into the soil, their gods into story, yet their presence remained like the scent of salt in the wind, invisible, enduring, everywhere. You could no longer see them, but you could still feel them, in the rhythm of language, in the shape of laws, in the patience of northern hearts. The North remembered itself, and in that quiet remembrance the Viking spirit lived on. Their first legacy was language. Old Norse had traveled with them across England, Ireland, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and deep into Russia. Even as tongues changed, it lingered in syllables and sounds, in words spoken every day by people who had long forgotten where they came from. In English, its traces still whisper: sky, window, husband, law, anger, gift, birth, skin, frost, each one a relic, a fragment of conversation from 1,000 years ago. Every time those words are spoken, a small piece of the Viking world breathes again. In the northern countries, the Norse tongue evolved rather than vanished. Old Norse became Icelandic, Norwegian, Danish, Swedish, each like a branch from the same sturdy trunk. And though centuries passed, Icelandic changed the least. An Icelander today can still read the old sagas almost as they were written, a bridge across a millennium. The language itself became a kind of time machine, carrying memory unbroken through the ages. The second legacy was law. Wherever they went, the Vikings had carried with them a respect for spoken agreement, for fairness decided among equals. They distrusted absolute authority, preferring assemblies, councils, voices in the open air. In Iceland, this became the Althing, the oldest surviving parliament in the world. In England, it shaped the common law that would spread across empires centuries later. The Norse sense of justice was practical, direct, and rooted in human understanding. Even kings, they believed, must stand beneath the same sky as everyone else. This legacy of equality outlasted every empire they built. It lived on in the customs of Northern Europe, in the idea that law was not simply decree, but dialogue. It is no coincidence that the most stable democracies of the modern world trace their ancestry to those windswept coasts. The Vikings had carried freedom with them even when they did not yet have a word for it. The third legacy was story. The sagas endured, copied by hand through centuries of war, plague, and reform. They traveled quietly, from monastery to library, from scholars' desks to the imagination of the modern world. In time, they would inspire poets, painters, explorers, and dreamers. They gave the North its mythology, its sense of self, its reminder that life, even in hardship, could be beautiful and worth remembering. When later generations looked back and asked who they were, it was the sagas that answered. They said, "You are the descendants of those who endured." In their tales, one finds not just battles and voyages, but a philosophy, a deep understanding of fate and impermanence. The Norse did not believe in endless triumph. They believed in standing firm, even when the end was known. Ragnarok was not despair. It was acceptance. To live well, even knowing that all things fade, that was their truest faith. And perhaps that is why their stories still move us, because they remind us how to face endings with grace. Their fourth legacy was craft. The beauty of their work, the intertwining knots, the carved beasts, the gleaming metalwork, never vanished. It resurfaced in medieval churches, in Gothic architecture, in the delicate patterns of later northern art. The same instinct for balance, for merging strength with grace, lived on in every design. Even in modern Scandinavia, the clean lines of wood and light, the quiet harmony of space, feel like distant echoes of those same hands that once carved rune stones beside fjords. The runes themselves endured too. Long after they ceased to be letters of daily use, they remained symbols of mystery, memory, and meaning. People still carve them on doors for protection, on gravestones for remembrance. Each line carried not just sound, but soul. To carve was to speak in silence, to leave a mark that even time respected. And above all, their legacy was endurance. The North had always been harsh, too cold for comfort, too vast for certainty. Yet its people had learned to thrive in it, to find beauty in austerity, peace in solitude. The Vikings had once sought glory through action. Their descendants found it through perseverance. They built societies where modesty was valued more than pride, where cooperation replaced conquest, and where the long dark winters became a time for reflection rather than despair. Even today, that spirit endures, in the resilience of the Nordic people, in their quiet confidence, in their sense of equality before both nature and each other. The fire that once burned in the longships now glows in candles on winter windowsills, in the patience of craftsmanship, in the calm dignity of a people who still listen to the sea. Centuries passed. The world grew faster, louder, stranger. But in the north, the rhythm remained slower, not because it could not change, but because it had already seen so much change before. It knew that the ocean outlasts the storm. It knew that silence is not absence, but wisdom. And it knew that to endure quietly is sometimes the greatest act of all. If you listen closely on a northern night, when the wind moves through pine and snow, when the stars seem close enough to touch, you can almost hear them, the faint creak of oars, the hum of a song half forgotten, a voice saying softly, "We are still here." The sea never forgets. The sea has never forgotten them. Long after their ships have vanished and their names have faded from stone, the waters still remember, each wave a whisper, each tide a memory. If you stand upon the cliffs of the north, when the wind is right, you can almost hear it, the faint pulse of oars, the creak of timber, the rhythm of voices singing against the dark, not loud, not proud, but steady, the same way it has always been. The Vikings are gone, yet they are everywhere, in the language that shapes our thoughts, in the laws that guide our hands, in the quiet strength that still defines the northern soul. They live in the patience of those who endure the long winters, in the humility of those who build without haste, in the balance between courage and calm that marks all who come from the cold. They no longer rule kingdoms, yet they rule something deeper, the imagination of the world. The sagas end, but their rhythm remains, the same rhythm that once carried ships across endless seas. It beats softly in the heart of every story told by a fire, in every song that begins slowly and ends in silence. Their faith may have changed, their gods may have fallen, but the essence of what they believed endures, that life is brief, that fate is vast, and that to live bravely, even for a moment, is to be eternal. The sea itself has been their monument. No marble, no gold, no empire could have lasted as long. Its surface is ever changing, but its depth never forgets. Somewhere beneath those waves lie the remains of their journeys, a ring, a blade, a fragment of hull. The salt preserves them, as if the ocean itself were keeping vigil. Every storm that passes carries their breath. Every calm morning holds their peace. Time has taken them, but it has not erased them. In that sense, they achieved what all people seek, to be remembered not just by name, but by feeling. When we think of them, we do not think of kings or wars. We think of the smell of pine tar, the sound of gulls, the shimmer of a cold horizon. We think of courage, quiet, enduring, human, and we feel somehow that they are still with us, watching from the edge of the sea they once called home. The north today is calm, fields green, cities bright, skies vast and clean. Yet beneath it all lies an older heartbeat, patient and steady. The longhouses are gone, but their warmth survives in the glow of hearths and candles. The runes are silent, but their meanings still hum beneath the alphabet. Even the churches, built upon the bones of temples, carry echoes in their stone. You can sense it when the wind moves through a fjord or when twilight settles upon the waves. That feeling that the world remembers more than it says. And so the story closes, not with conquest or loss, but with peace. The Viking Age was never truly about war. It was about exploration of seas, of souls, of what it means to live with courage under uncertain skies. They were not gods or monsters, but people, flawed, proud, searching, and in their long search, they found something we all still seek, a sense of belonging in a vast and changing world. If you ever find yourself by the northern sea, close your eyes, listen. The wind against your face, the cold against your hands, that is their touch. The faint echo in the waves, that is their voice. The sea remembers. It always has. If you enjoyed drifting through this piece of the past, maybe leave a like, or just let the story carry you to sleep. And if you'd like to hear more quiet journeys like this one, you can subscribe. But only if it feels right. The world remembers you.